Welcome to New York City and Mission City Church. We're here to connect people with God and with each other. We hope you're encouraged by this week's message.
I would love to share with you a little tiny area of life that we're going to talk about for the next half hour or so. A little tiny area of life. You probably don't think about it very much, but if you ignore it, it will force you to pay attention. I'm going to introduce it with a story. When I was 24 years old, I got my second job working at a church. I was 24 years old. I was what they called a resident. A resident is where you have you're a one-year temp employee. You get paid part-time and you work full-time, which is a great deal. And if you are not familiar with church work and church world, you may be surprised that things like this even exist. But if you are hoping to be trained as a pastor, this is like the happy hunting ground because you get to ask questions. There's a classroom component. There's like real life ministry you get to do with people, and it is just so crazy exciting. And I have 10 months to just get in there and just have fun and learn all I can. So I decide I am going no limits. I decide there's no reason why I don't work 24/7 other than just the bare necessities of sleep. In fact, if I lose some sleep over work, that's okay. If I break some boundaries over work, that's okay. I am not married. I am not dating anyone. I am available for church. I am here to do church. And I decided I'm going to go no limits. So sure enough, that's exactly what happened. And I decided that anytime the phone rang, I was going to volunteer. Anytime there was a need, I was going to say yes. I was going to be the yes person. Because after all, what's 10 months? You can run for 10 months, right? So a friend of mine came up to me actually about a month into this. We were new to each other. And he said, he had this look of concern in his eye. And he said, you do ministry and things like you're on a stopwatch. And I made that into a compliment in my mind, like, yeah, why waste the time? I was like, thank you. I was like, why waste the time? I didn't know what to do with that. But he was, of course, actually concerned because he felt like I was ignoring this one little part of life that you can only ignore for so long before it forces you to pay attention. And so I kind of brushed that off. And then I decided, you know what, I'm going to keep going. And sure enough, a few months later, I did not feel like myself anymore. I did not feel well. I felt frustrated for no apparent reason. I felt tired even though I had slept. I felt like my emotions were out of whack even though there was nothing to be emotional about. I felt far from God even though I was surrounded by God stuff. I was working at church. I was surrounded by God, everything. Everything's about God. And yet I felt personally distant from God because I was disobeying the laws of this one little area of life that I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes that you can ignore only for so long before they force you to pay attention. And that area is, of course, limits. I'm going to talk today about limits. We all have them. You can ignore them for a while, but eventually they will catch up to you. I want everyone to know what I'm talking about when I say limits. So here are a few kinds of limits. The first one you probably already thought of. We have to have some limits as far as it relates to our work week. You cannot work, this is the one I was just speaking about for myself. You cannot work constantly every waking hour and even sacrifice your sleeping hours in order to work. Eventually, you must do something other than work. You can do it maybe for a week, maybe for a month, maybe for a year, maybe even for a decade, but eventually you and your relationships and your emotional state and your wellness will show up if there's not some kind of limit on work. Doing in general, just to do, like there's some kind of limit we have to have on our doing or we will not be well. Thinking, you ever just been tired of thinking? Like, I need to go turn my brain off. So if you have a job where you're like, you know what, I'm constantly doing critical thinking, I need to go on a jog and just think of nothing. I need to empty my brain. It's because we all have a limit on how much we can actually think. We have limits on how much we can move. This is why you need to be still. This is why when you leave your apartment on a Saturday and you're like, I live in New York City. Yes, I do. And on Saturday, I get to go wherever I want and I'm going to go have fun. And you leave at 10 a.m. and you're like, I love this place. I'm going to run. And by 5 p.m., you feel like you cannot wait to get away. You are exhausted because the city has given to you and taken from you all at the same time. Because there's only so much moving you can actually do. We all have a limit. Directing. There's only so much you can direct. So if you have kids, all right, I think we all knew when mom had passed the limit, or when we rather had passed the limit. My mom would have this saying, I don't know if anyone said this, but she would always say, I have had it. And when she has had it, it's kind of a confusing phrase. You're like, what is it and why are you having it? But of course, what it means is that she is tired of directing, and there was a line there, and I think we just crossed it. We didn't even know the limit was there, but she had a limit, and we cross it. There's only so much directing you can do before you actually get exhausted. There's only so much deciding you can do. Sometimes leaders of organizations will talk about decision-making fatigue. It's like, I think I'm just tired of making the calls. I think there's only so many decisions I can make in a day. So we all have limits on how much we can decide. We have limits on how much we can wait. Wait on person. Wait on a thing. Wait on God. There's only so much waiting we can do before eventually we go, I'm at my limit. Even, unfortunately, there's a limitation on how much love we can give. We all have limitations. And if you just try to keep loving without some sort of refreshment, you may find yourself exhausted. So there are limits to life. And the way this relates to our current fall sermon collection, which is called How to Be Okay When Things Aren't. Things are not okay. Things are difficult in our surrounding environment, in our country, in this time. And we are looking for the previous 2 and the next 6 weeks, including tonight, at how to be okay in our inner life, even though our outer life is quite chaotic. And there are a few things that we need in order to be okay, even when things aren't. And one of those things is limits you listen to. You need some limits you listen to. Otherwise, your 2020 is going to go from bad to worse. Because if you decide, you know what, no limits. I'm just going to lower my shoulder. I'm going to get through this. I have the energy. I have what it takes. They're the haves and the have-nots. I am the have, and I am going to be able to get through this. You cannot get through this. We all have limits that we must listen to. And eventually, if we deny them long enough, they will force us to listen. So today is the idea that we all have limits we listen to. One clarification before we go. I am well aware that there are parts of your life and schedule that you cannot control. They are called bosses, jobs, tasks, classes, professors, spouses, kids, families, landlords, bills, and so much more. I am well aware that you do not control 100% of those. And the reason I'm saying that is because I have been in the sermon where the pastor's going to give the big listen to your limits sermon. And it just sounds like he's going to tell everybody how to live a perfectly balanced life because everything is perfectly controlled. And nobody has kids who wake up in the middle of the night, and nobody has a boss who actually has authority. And they preach into this void as if people don't have real issues and real problems. So I am well aware that it makes no sense to be up here talking about how to obey your limits, when you're actually living real life and there are parts of your life you cannot control. You know, like what if you're not sleeping well? And I would say, you know what? You got to obey your limits. You got to sleep. And you're like, well, I have a 2-month-old who does not speak English, and I speak English, and we can't. It doesn't work, right? So you can't. I understand there are parts of your life that you cannot perfectly control. You cannot control when your boss emails. I understand that. So I want you to know what we're aiming for here is not the delusion. I'm not under the delusion that you can control 100% of your schedule in your life. There are parts of your life you can't control. What I want to do today is I want to acknowledge the parts of life you can't control, but I'm here to encourage how to be wise with the parts you can. There are parts of your life that you can observe wise limits, and we're here to talk about those. I'm going to share 3 things tonight. First, that God designed limits. Second, that Jesus embraced limits. And before we're done here today, that the gospel includes the future removal of limits. That's where we're going for the next couple of minutes. First, God designed limits. Limits are from God. So sin and brokenness has distorted what they are and confused us about where the limits are at times, but God actually designed limits. Let's take a look at this one. It is vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil. For he, that's God, gives to his beloved sleep. So there's a natural limitation. You will sleep. If we would like to bet, you will sleep. So, but it says he gives to his beloved. So giving, that's like a gift word, his beloved. So sleep is actually a gift. It's not something to resist. It's a limitation to embrace because God actually gives it as a gift and we must embrace it. You will sleep. You can disbelieve in God and you will sleep soon. You can disbelieve in sleep and you will sleep soon. This is a built-in limitation that God has put on the human body that every one of us must observe, which is pretty good evidence, wouldn't you agree, that God actually designed limits. They are from him. Every human being in the world, regardless of worldview, must actually sleep. So God actually designed this limit, and it is meant to be observed. We are not going to evolve past needing to sleep. This is a God-designed limit. I'm a fan of Apple products. I'm one of those people, but I'm not as far out there as I'm in the tribe. But some people in this room, I'm not going to say, are like leaders of the tribe. And when I say I'm not going to say, his initials are Nate Jones. So, but I'm not going to say nothing about anybody else. But okay, so we're fans of Apple products, and what Apple likes to do, like any technology company, is come out with something that is better and longer lasting. So every single time there was like the iPhone, but then there was the such and such Pro and the battery life is longer. There's the MacBook, but then there's the Pro, the MacBook Pro, and the battery life is longer. There's the AirPods, but then there's the AirPods Pro and the battery life is longer. It's like, I think you guys are planning this. So you know a few out that the battery is going to get longer. Why don't you just do it now? So the battery life gets longer every single time. There is no human being Pro coming out. Like your battery cannot be reduced. There is no tip. There is no technique. You are going to need 5 to 8 hours. Some would say 9. But 6 to 8, okay, somewhere in there, most of the population is somewhere in 6 to 8. You got to have it. This is a limitation you must have. And there is something in us from the youngest age that wants to defy this limit. Kids rage against the limit of sleep every night. I think this is why they rage against bath time. I don't think it's that they hate the bath, some maybe a little bit, but especially that it's a signal that the day is winding down and we're going to now go do nothing while we recharge for the next day. That just tortures a child. I still feel a little version of this. Gabby goes to sleep before I do, and I try to stay up and read. We go to bed around 10:30, 11:30. You just never know. Somewhere around there. Some of you, that sounds late. Some of you think we're so old and that's very early. But that's about where we go to sleep. And when we say goodnight, I then turn and read for as long as I can. And when I feel sleep creep up on me, I go, no. I have a stack of books on my nightstand, and I want to read every page so bad. And I just feel it. I'm like, I don't want to shut it down, but we have to. It's a God-ordained limit. He gave us a fixed design. If we resist it, we resist it to our peril. He needs this. Here's another thing, or we need this rather. We need something else, and this is completely revolutionary. This is one of my favorite, maybe my very favorite, God-designed limits that He offers His people. This is the 6-day work week. Let's get in our time machine. Let's go back 3,500 years, which is also a plane, and we're going to go to another hemisphere. All right, so we are now at about 1500 BC, and we are with the nation known as the nation of Hebrews, all right, or the nation of Israel. And God has delivered His people miraculously. God started with a man named Abraham, and that man became a family, and then that family became a nation. And then we have the nation of Israel, who is coming out of Egypt, out of slavery, if you've heard, through the Red Sea, if you're familiar with the story. And then they're going to be a new nation who is very distinct from the surrounding nations. God is the founding father, and He is the only one. And He is writing a new constitution, and that is the law, which is also known as our Old Testament. So and it starts with the preamble to the Constitution, if you will, the 10 Commandments, all right? Exodus chapter 20. And in the 10 Commandments, there were some commands that sounded a lot like other moral laws, other moral laws of the surrounding nations. Things like don't kill anyone. Things like don't sleep with somebody else's spouse. Those laws were known to other nations, but there was the 4th commandment in the list of 10 that was this. Totally unique in the ancient Near East. Here it comes. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. That means not like the other days. You got 6 of one kind, you got 1 of a different one. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. So in 6 days, if it doesn't fit, that's the word all. So if that doesn't fit in 6, you're done. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And then he continues. On it, you're like, I think they got it. Nope, we're going again. On it, you shall not do any work, in case you missed it the first time. So this is God restating himself. You, and then he goes through the roll call, just to make sure it's completely clear. You, your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, the cows don't work. Are you kidding me? Nobody works. Or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. So your visitor doesn't work. He could have just said, no one works, but he made sure to say, absolutely no one is going to do any work on this day. And then it keeps going. For in 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that's in them. And then he rested on the 7th day. Not because he was tired, he's God, but as a signal to us what it is that we need to do in our rhythm of life. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. In the ancient Near East, there was nothing like this. They had discovered the 7-day work week, but there was no reason not to just work every day. This is the ancient Near East. It's hard out here. All right, so you got to work or you don't eat. This is a difficult environment. And to not work could have even sounded like negligence at best, or maybe even suicidal to not work. And what the nation of Israel was to do was to say, you are our God, our work is not our God, and we are depending on you, not ourselves. So we're going to work really hard 6 days. We're going to outwork all the other surrounding nations. So we're not saying we're not going to work hard. We're just saying we're going to work hard and then we're going to stop. And that is a declaration of dependence, not of independence, but a declaration of dependence on God that God wove into the nation of Israel. Think about how different that is than a culture that says that we are going to get our meaning from our work, we are going to get our identity from our work, we are going to get everything about us that we like about us, we're going to get it from our doing, we're going to get it from our work. See, ancient cultures just gave meaning to people by virtue of the family. So if you were born a long time ago in a different culture, then there's a good chance that you are handed a place of significance just because you're there. Hey, we're glad you're here, you're a part of this family, and you do this in the world. Way to go. Now, we are the first culture in all of history that said you will find your meaning and identity based on what you build. Now, what does that do to our sense of limitation? It means we don't want limits because now we got to go make ourselves into something, and our identity's on the line here. So we got to go get it done. I found this quote, and by the way, if you're wondering if we are in New York City, in the house of this temptation, we are. No place in the history of the world has ever been more dedicated to the hustle. Now, I don't want to demonize this. I love New York City. I intend to be in New York City. I intend to raise kids in New York City. I'm in. Honorary New Yorker right here. So I am way with this. I believe in hustle. I believe we got to work hard. And I love the story of New York City and all of the people who have come here and given their lives to hustle. However, there's a difference between hustling because you got to eat and hustling even though you got plenty to eat and you're going to find your identity in it, so you just disobey limits. I want you to hear this quotation. I gathered this from Rick Burns' New York documentary, which is literally 17 and a half hours long, and it's a history of New York City. And this quotation was played in a moment when you can see the Lower East Side about 100 years ago, and there's 25,000 push carts in the Lower East Side. A push cart is like a cross between like a table and a wheelbarrow. So it's a flat top, wheels, and you're running and you're selling your stuff, okay? And it is hustle time. And listen to the advice one person gave to another when they came to New York. Forget your past. Doesn't matter where you come from. Forget your past. This is not scripture, in case anyone wonders. Forget your past. Forget your customs. Forget your ideals. You're in New York now. Select a goal, and pursue it. So you got to chase this down with all your might. You will experience a bad time, but sooner or later you will achieve your goal. You're like, oh, it doesn't sound so bad. How about this? A bit of advice for you. Do not take a moment's rest. Okay, if you have any bad advice radar anywhere around you, this should be going off right about now. A bit of advice for you. Do not take a moment's rest. Unless, of course, you literally must double and triple and quadruple jobs so that you can eat. That's different. I'm talking about doing this voluntarily so that you feel important and you feel achieved. Run, do, work, and keep your own good in mind. Do not say, I cannot or I do not know. So the advice here is, which New York City has whispered, either in these words or one person to another, or perhaps just in the attitude and the culture that's in the air, we naturally absorb this thing that says, no limits, you're here now, and you better go. And you better not admit any limitation on your knowledge. You better not accept any limitation on your ability. And you better not, don't even sleep actually while we're at it. Let's just go. And we have dedicated ourselves for some better. So I'm not only being critical here, but for the better and also for the worse. We have dedicated ourselves to the hustle. And as the people of God, we've got to have the ability to know we cannot devote ourselves to work at every waking hour. And at this point, you might be thinking, but wait, my boss. I just want to remind you where we started. We are acknowledging the part of life that you can't control. I know you got a boss, but we're trying to be wise with the parts that you can, right? So the part of your life that you can control, we want to declare our dependence on God and our identity from God, and that is what identifies us. Just like the nation of Israel 3,500 years ago would look very different from the surrounding communities because of their willingness to stop working and say, I trust God. As a New Yorker and a Christian, you will drastically separate yourself in a good way from your surrounding communities by saying, I declare my dependence on God. I am here not only to work, but I am here to live according to who God says I am to be. All right, so God designed limits. All right, second, Jesus embraced limits. Did you know this? So Jesus not only is fully God, but he is fully man. This is often neglected because we are used to singing to Jesus as God. He is indeed God. That's totally appropriate. But he's also fully man. So Jesus actually got tired. And I love this because it shows that infinite God, uncontainable God, became a human being who lived and grew and aged and died ultimately, only to rise again, of course. But he was confined to the frailty of a human body. So let's take a look at this. Here's one. Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. Sitting is another key word there. He was tired, so he just sat down. This is the kind of thing Jesus does. He got tired. This is my favorite one personally. A furious squall came up. This is when Jesus is on a boat with some disciples, and there was a storm, and this is 2,000 years ago at this point. You are in danger of dying, all right? A furious squall, that's a storm on a lake when you're on a boat, came up and the waves broke over the boat. Okay, they broke over the boat, so it was nearly swamped. So almost everyone died. Jesus was in the stern, that's the back of the boat, asleep and then on a cushion. Let me ask you, boats don't come with cushions 2,000 years ago? Did he bring this? He's like, I'm asleep. He knows the weather. He knows the weather. And he's like, I am going to bring my pillow for this ride. And you want to talk about being okay when things aren't? We are in a storm and we are okay. Completely okay, even when the situation is not. Jesus actually embraced limits. He had no other option. You also, because he voluntarily confined himself to a human body. So he, in addition to this, when he was healing people, masses of people, and they're coming out of the woodwork to make him king and try to get help with their health issues and get all of the things that they need from him, and he literally, you can see it in the scripture, it says but he withdrew from them and went to a desolate place. Like, not now, I'm tired, I'm going to go over here. I know all of your problems are really important. I love you. I do. But I got to go over here now and be with God and pray. Even Jesus, right? So we all have to embrace our limits. If we have any wisdom in us at all, any spiritual health in us at all, we are not going to be able to keep going past what God in the flesh could even do. It's amazing how we try to outrun Jesus when it comes to our human designs and needs and to-do list. So if Jesus withdraws better than you, I'll say this, if Jesus withdraws better than you, there may be a chance you think you're stronger than him, even though you wouldn't say it that way, would you? But if Jesus knows how to withdraw and be with the Father and be with him, rather than doing, there might be a chance that you think somewhere along the way that you don't need everything he needed and maybe you can just power through, and that is a dangerous thing. And you're only going to get by so long by doing that. So not only did God design limits, but Jesus embraced limits. Lastly, the gospel includes, I'm going to define that word, the gospel includes the future removal of limits altogether for you. So if you're in Christ, the gospel, the good news, includes the future removal of limits. So let's take the word gospel first, and then we'll talk future and limits. What's the gospel? The gospel is, we're a gospel community. This is the backbone of our church. If you're like, give me the Cliff Notes of church, here it is. If someone's like, what's the core message of Christianity? I don't know if I'm going to sign up for it, but I'd like to know what it is. This, imperfectly phrased, is what it is. This is not from the Bible. This is a summary of biblical teaching. The gospel is the good news that though this world and all humanity is broken, what does that mean? It's bad out there and it's bad in here, both. So though this world and all humanity is broken and separated from God, God has loved us enough to build a bridge back to himself. So even though we said, no thanks God, I'm going to go over here, he loved us enough to build a bridge back to himself. What is that bridge? Jesus Christ, the Son of God, lived a perfect life that we failed to live. He died a death that we deserve because we're sinners and broken for review, and rose again to prove that it all counted. By trusting in this, not by working, but by trusting in this, we have a connection with God that changes everything, starting today and lasting forever, there's the future piece, into a permanent, just, and satisfying world, because this world is neither just nor satisfying. Amen? So, this means that the good news is that Jesus lived, died, and rose, and that by faith in him, we have a relationship with him that starts today and lasts forever. And we will ultimately end up in a better place. So I now want to talk about that better place as it relates to limits. I told you that so I can tell you this. We have no limits in the eternal state, the place some call heaven, the perfect, all right? There are no limits on love. Wouldn't you like there to be no limits on love? I would. There are no limits on love. This is 1 Corinthians 13, the famous wedding. Some of you probably read it at your wedding. It's the famous love chapter. It's not even about necessarily romantic love, although I'm sure some of you maybe did have it read at your wedding. It says when the perfect comes. Now that's the new world. That's what some call heaven, okay? The ultimate place where all of our desires are met. When the perfect comes, the partial, that's what we get now as far as love goes. This chapter is about love. So when the perfect comes, which is the perfect state of being when we're with God forever, the partial will pass away. So the fact that we can only get so close to God and each other is going to go away. For now, there is this whole age we're in right now. For now, we see in a mirror dimly. Back then, the mirrors weren't very good, you know? It's like you're looking at a piece of glass, kind of, and it's dirty. So mirrors were not all that great. For now, we see in a mirror dimly, but then we see face to face. So when we are with God, we will be with God. Now I know in part. So I know God in part, I know myself in part, I know others in part, but then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. Now, if you want a good definition of true love, It is to know fully and to be fully known. This is what you want. This is the root of your romantic desires. This is the root of your sexual desires. This is the root of all your relational desires. We all desire to be fully known and loved anyway, to be fully known and to know fully. That's what mutual love is in every context. And in the presence of God, where if you have trusted in the gospel, you will be there and there will be no limits on love. It's going to be really refreshing. This verse got me. There is no limit in terms of societal tier, particularly as it relates to race in heaven. Take a look at this. After this, I looked, and behold, a great multitude. This is a vision of heaven, a vision of the eternal state. A great multitude that no one could number. Too many people, so many people, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne. Now, this is vivid because it says every people group is there. Every people group, with their skin tones and with their ethnicities, with them in the eternal state. So when you go to heaven, you will not be clear. All right? You will have your ethnicity with you in the eternal state. But for the first time in world history, there will be no ranking to it. There will be no suspicion to it. There will be no fatigue to it. There will be no fear to it. There will be no superiority to it. There will certainly be no oppression to it. We will, for the first time, have what we all long for so deeply, which is to say that all people as individuals and people groups as groups are able to coexist in the presence of God, because once again, it's not about us, it is about Him and what He did for us. And it's not about ourselves. It's not about ourselves individually or about our particular people. It is about Him. And finally, we will be in a place where there is no limitation. That's a beautiful thing. I mean, if 2020 has made you tired for any reason, this should be inspiring. So there's no limits as it relates to our social standing. And then third, there are no limits on time.
Thanks for being with us. If these messages are strengthening you in your faith, we want to hear from you. Find us online at missioncity.nyc or email us at info@missioncity.nyc so we can celebrate everything God's doing in your life. We'll see you next week.